Hello everyone, this is Yana Smakula. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have 3 card ideas to share, all showing a new technique I've been playing with lately, and I call this stamp and turn. It's very simple, and one you would be able to use with many of the background stamps you already have in your stash. I'm creating with products from Simon Says Stamp. I have the new Holiday Stems and Berries Cling background stamp, as well as using some older stamps from my stash. Let's jump right to it. Now you want to start by cutting your paper to 6 by 6 inches, or about that size, depending on the size of the stamp you're using. I'm using cling background stamps, and these are all cut just slightly smaller than 6 inches square, so cutting my paper to 6 inches square works for me. If you're using a smaller stamp, just cut your paper to about the size of the stamp. Using a stamp positioner will make the stamping process a lot easier, although you don't have to use it. This technique can be done without the stamp positioner, as it doesn't require precise stamping. Now, not every stamp will work for this technique. Background stamps with designs like this will work. Stamps that have directional imagery will not be the best choice. Now, you also want to use a stamp that has some solid areas to it. Outline stamps will not give you the same look, and I'll show you several options, several examples during this video. The idea is to stamp the same image in 2 different colors of ink, one shadow color and one main color. I picked Fossil ink from Simon Says Stamp for my shadow layer. This is a very pale gray color, and you want to use something that will give you a subtle look. Not too vibrant, not too dark, but something subtle. Once I stamp it, it does look a little bit dark, but remember, dye inks will lighten a little bit once the ink dries. You don't need a perfectly stamped image impression. You can see this is far from perfect, but it's good enough for this technique. Next, pick up the paper and turn it 90 degrees. It doesn't matter which way you turn it, just turn. Next, use your main ink color. I'm using green leaf here from Simon Says Stamp, and I just ink up my image and stamp it. This impression will be the main impression on the card, so you might need to double stamp it to avoid imperfections. I will also be trimming this background down to cover an A2 card front, so I'm not too worried about these edges where I have imperfections, as I know I'll have that cut off. So here's a look at this background. You have a pretty green pattern with some very subtle shadow stamping in the background. The shadow adds a little bit of interest and it fills the background in. I think this looks quite lovely, especially considering that it didn't take long to stamp at all. Now let's try this again, but with another stamp. So this is the pine cone background stamp from Simon Says Stamp, and this is a perfect one for this technique. So again, you stamp it once in a light color of ink, your shadow color. Now this doesn't have to be light gray, it could be light brown, it could be light blue, light green, whatever color you want, but it has to be a light color. Then turn your paper 90 degrees and stamp the same image again in your main ink color. I'm using the same colors of ink here as before, but I'm also adding a little bit of brown using Sparrow ink from Simon, and this will give me a brown-green background. I think it's very fitting for this particular image. And here's the finished result. As I bring it closer to the camera, you can see the shadow stamping in the background. It adds a nice touch and it adds interest. The shadow stamping isn't visible under the main image, making it look as if the background was masked, when in fact it wasn't. It fills the background in nicely. Now here's another background stamp, but this is leaf and berries. This one is not ideal for this technique as it does have a lot of open space, but I figured I can color the open leaves in, creating a more solid background look. This will be a little bit more time consuming, but it will look pretty in the end. Again, I'm stamping this one in background ink color. The light gray looks very pretty. I love the soft, subtle look. Next, I turn the background and stamp this again in my main ink color, green leaf. You can see this doesn't give me quite the same result as did the 2 previous backgrounds. That's because this is a more open stamp design. So remember, not every stamp will work for this technique. So here's a look at the patterns I have stamped using this technique. They are pretty simple, but the subtle light gray background stamping adds a nice touch to the background. You can also use this with other, not just holiday backgrounds. It would work beautifully with floral designs, especially when you combine the light gray and pink or the light gray and yellow colors. From here, you can use these backgrounds to make any kinds of cards you like. I did some simple stamping and just created some sentiments, and then I foam mounted the sentiments onto these backgrounds. For my first card, I used the Holiday Silhouettes stamp and coordinating die from Kathy Zelski. I heat embossed the sentiment in Simon's Antique Gold embossing powder, and I also re-stamped the joy part of the sentiment on another piece of paper in red ink using Simon's Lipstick Red. I wanted to have a combination of pretty gold and red on this card. I trimmed the stamped background to just 1/8 of an inch smaller than an A2 card front, and I foam mounted it onto the card. I also foam mounted the sentiment panel. Now, I wanted to add a lot more red to this card design, so I embellished the background using red gems from Spellbinders. I added lots of gems onto the background, covering some of the stamped berry images. Now, I wanted to use the Nuvo drops at first, but I haven't used mine in a long time, and it seems they've dried out over the summer. At least the bottle with the red drops has dried out, and the drops liquid now comes out super thick. So I opted to use gems instead, and these gems are very pretty, and they come in 4 different sizes, starting from the smallest 2mm gems. Next, I cut out the red joy, and I also stamped an additional holly leaf and berry cluster using Simon's Perfection ink. I cut that out using a coordinating die. I then added 3 large gems onto the berry stamping, and I foam mounted both the red joy and the holly cluster onto this card. For my second card, I added a Season's Greetings sentiment, and this was created using Simon's Winter Birds stamp set and coordinating dies. I heat embossed it in Antique Gold embossing powder, and then I just redded a red cardstock sub-sentiment for a pop of red on this card. And I think that this card is probably my favorite of all. I didn't film the process of creating this card as it was fairly simple, but I really love the way it turned out. And for my last card, I first used a red pen to color the berries red. I went with a red pen from Jane Davenport, although you can as easily use a red marker or a red pencil. And I colored each of the dots or each of the berries on the background red. Here, you can also use gems for the berries, but you do have a lot more berries on this background, so it made more sense to use a pen. Next, I used Copic markers in YG03 and YG17 and colored the leaves dual tone green. Now, the leaves have a single vein in the center dividing them into 2 parts. So I used that to color one part light green and the other part dark green. I think that worked well, giving a modern twist to this card. To create a sentiment, I first stamped one in red and black. I did some masking to achieve this look, but I somehow didn't like the sentiment in the end, and I heat embossed it in gold embossing powder afterwards. Looking at this card now, I wish I had kept it as is, as I do like that combination of black and red inks a lot better. Now here's how I put these together. Like I said, I trimmed the background to about 1/8 of an inch smaller than an A2 card front. I added 4 sheets of scrap cardstock adhered together from the back to add dimension to this panel, to all of my panels, and also to make the cards sturdier. And this gave me a pretty thin white border around the background. It's barely noticeable, but it is there. And then I foam mounted the sentiment on top. Here you can see me fussing with the black and red sentiment, but later I replace it with the antique gold one. It does look pretty, but I think the red one looked a little bit better. So that's my stamp and turn background technique. Have you ever tried this technique? What is your favorite technique for creating background stamps? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear some new ideas. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.